Here with me today is Alex Leveringhaus. He's a lecturer in political theory and co-director for the Center for International Intervention at the University of Surrey. He's also coordinator for the Special Interest Group for Ethics and Artificial Intelligence at the university. He was previously a postdoc at Oxford, at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. He was researching robotic combat systems and assessing their impact on normative and legal frameworks. The outcome of this was this book. I only have a digital copy here, but it's a great book. It's called Ethics and Autonomous Weapons. I'll put it here, like people typically put books. I put an ebook
Thank you.
on screen. Alex was before that a research member at Wolfson College in Oxford and did his PhD at, in government at the London School of Economics. Thanks so much for joining today, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dominic. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited about this talk. So, you've been working on this topic since 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Probably thinking about it much longer than that. Can you tell us what's happening? Why should we talk about autonomous weapon systems? Is that some kind of academic science fiction? Why work on this and why worry?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question to start us off. And I like the fact that you use the term science fiction, because some critics of the debate surrounding autonomous weapons have criticized its participants for engaging in science fiction or for setting up philosophical issues that might be very interesting to political philosophers or ethicists such as myself, but that actually have very little impact on the real work. And, you know, you sometimes get this in, I guess, academic settings where people ask these big picture questions, but it's not quite clear as to whether they actually have any practical ramifications. So I think I would have sort of on top of my head two reasons as to why we should care. So the first reason is that we should generally care about weapons and weapon systems and the sort of technologies that states seek to develop, but also that the private sector seeks to develop. That is just a general point. And it seems to me in my own field of political philosophy that there's not sufficient attention paid to that. And I think, you know, that is really a big issue. So there's a general reason to care. Now, with regard to autonomous weapon systems, I think one of the points I would raise here is that we will see developments towards machine autonomy in many sectors within society. And eventually, those sorts of developments will also bubble up in the military sector. So we are looking at autonomous driving, for example, robo-cars, robot-taxis, I think, even operate in San Francisco nowadays. I mean, so we see these kinds of developments, and I think it's only a question of time that really, you know, the military will try to take advantage of those. Look, if you have a self-driving car, for example, the good old robot taxi in San Francisco, and, you know, it performs reliably and so on and so forth. Well, why not weaponize it? Why not stick a gun on it, for example? That's what we've seen, I think, very much with remote control systems. So if you look at the history of drones, what people call drones, rightly or wrongly, so these would be systems that are controlled via a remote control by an operator. And initially those systems started out really as surveillance and reconnaissance systems. Well, and, you know, they have a high resolution sensor suite. You can fly around in a particular area. You can gather data. You can gather information, you know, potentially about your enemy. Well, once you have a communications link, you know, once you have a high resolution sensor suite, once you have relatively reliable remote control of your platform, why not weaponize it? Why not put a Hellfire missile on it? And so I think the sort of step from kind of systems that are already existing, systems that exist potentially in the civilian domain towards a more militarized application. It's not necessarily a big leap, but can really sometimes be a step. So I think, to come back to the science fiction point, it's not too far-fetched to imagine, autonomous weapon systems, either as already existing or coming into existence in the future. Much of it, and I guess we will touch on that, depends on how you define machine autonomy. But that's what I think we should care, ultimately.
Right. So you said it's not that far-fetched to imagine such systems. What kind of image should we have? What kind of image should we imagine? Like, what options are there for this use?
So I'm really glad you're asking this, because the image that sometimes comes up is the image of the Terminator, walking around and trying to find Sarah Connor. And indeed, I'm with Dapo Akande, who teaches law, international law at Oxford. I wrote an opinion piece for the Times that must have been in 2014 on autonomous weapon systems and the legal regulation. And we were so keen to preempt the application of science fiction scenarios to this. And what do the editors at the Times do? They put a picture of the Terminator in the newspaper. We were so annoyed when this happened. So not necessarily the Terminator walking around and sounding suspiciously like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I think there are going to be a variety of systems. So I think one good distinction to make here is between different functions of an autonomous weapon. We can come back to that probably later. So look, the self-driving taxi, from the example I gave such a minute ago, well, you could very well, just imagine a vehicle, that is able to drive autonomously and that is able to carry out certain functions that would be useful in the field, to the military. Now, I think it's important, and that's the point I make in the book, to differentiate that from functions which are central to the targeting process, especially the acquisition of a target and the ultimate enactment of a targeting decision. But when you, for example, look at existing drones, then the existing drones can already fly autonomously for long periods of time. They can enter a particular area of operations undetected. You want to cap the satellite link in order to do so you can't be tracked by the enemy. So imagine a tank, and that's a technological feat that, for example, can drive autonomously, and where the targeting function could be remote controlled, but where the tank, can drive autonomously. Think, for example, about a submarine. So drones, if you look at remote controlled systems, are of course very often associated with airplanes or airborne vehicles of some sort. That's sort of the image of the Predator drone, for example. So the Americans have used quite a bit, or some of the more experimental drone like the X-47B. Now, the point is that sort of these drone systems or remote control systems are developed across all branches of the military, not just the Air Force. So for the Navy as well, for the regular Army as well, and so on and so forth. And one of the big problems you have when it comes to the Navy or naval applications of drone technology is that it's difficult underwater to control a vehicle, a weapon remotely. That's quite difficult to do. So you could just argue in those sorts of circumstances, why not automate to a very, very high level indeed? And, that makes the particular platform much more suitable to its operating environment. So think of an autonomously operating submarine. Think of the self-driving tank. Think you could also potentially about border robots that are used to control border posts and so on. I mean,
That's
really
actually
interesting.
Already in use, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you can see some of the pitfalls of this reliance on automation. So it's like to go off on a tangent here, but look at the 7th of October attack by Hamas. I mean, the point is that large parts of, whatever you think about this conflict or the background to it, but the point is that large parts of the early warning systems and of the border between the Gaza Strip and Israeli state territory were automated. And partly the reason why Hamas was so successful was by targeting some of the communications and automation infrastructure, and were able to gain access, to Israeli state territory. We all know what the consequences of that were. But you can see sort of some pitfalls here. But it also shows, that automation is very widely used, or high levels of automation is very widely used by military, border police, across the world. And you can see, with computing power, with advances in civilian areas, also, advances in military research, that just increases.
Hmm. Right. So also in your work, you focus a lot on the actual use of force rather
Yeah.
than say other parts, other functions in the military,
Mm.
um, where AI is used a lot, like in
Yeah.
planning and organizing moving of equipment, also in reconnaissance and
Yeah.
in actually something that I think is like a comes very close to your work as well is generating targets
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
that are then approved by humans,
Hmm.
but that are generated by a machine. But that's not so much what you talk about. Is that right?
No, I mean, but I mean, you can sort of see similar issues emerging,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
I
very
mean,
much.
yes, so advanced targeting operations or target planning, that's
Mm-hmm.
also very much reliant on sets of data on computer
Yeah.
technology. I mean, the US Army very famously, or the US military, I should say, uses this program, which is colloquially called bug splat, so that can model, for example, the civilian sort of casualties that would arise from, a particular application of force to a target. And
Yeah.
it's called bug splat because the dead civilians sort of
Interesting.
appear as little red dots on the
Interesting.
screen. So you can
Yeah.
sort of roughly have an idea as to what, a military strike would cause in terms of
Mm-hmm.
casualties. And you can try to model that as well. But you were absolutely right. In those circumstances, there would still have to be a human decision as to whether
Right.
to sort of go along with this particular strike. And I
Yeah.
would think, given how Western militaries increasingly operate, it would pend approving or approval from a military lawyer as to whether the target, or especially whether the civilian casualties or any other casualties caused by a particular attack would satisfy the criteria of military necessity, distinction, proportionality, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. What's more problematic, I think, and this is also something that the Israelis are said to have done in the current conflict of Gaza, is to kind of try to map or generate the probability of particular targets being in particular areas. It
Yeah.
seems to me that's quite different from just assessing where you've already selected a target and you now want to know something about the fallout. That seems to be much more about predicting the
Yeah.
actual target rather than just predicting the consequences of an attack. And I think
Yeah.
that there is a sort of distinction to be made. Now, with regard to autonomous weapon systems, I guess you would even go a step further, namely where the system itself isn't able to enact a targeting decision. So, but you can see again, what I was saying earlier about steps. Look, once you can model targets, once you can model the fallout of an attack, once you can potentially predict where a target might be, well, why not put this into a software, into an autonomous weapon system, into a
It's not.
self-driving tank? So you can see how these sort of building blocks can be stacked up on each other.
Yeah. It's not such a big step anymore. So the
That's right.
Israeli programs you've been talking about, I guess, is like Gospel and Lavender.
I guess, yeah, that was the name that was used.
That's what they
yeah.
called it. There's not that much known about what
No.
exactly they do, but it's about what you described as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that it's not, it definitely doesn't seem impossible to build autonomous weapon systems. What's the benefit? Why would militaries do it, or do they even want to do it?
Right. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, there are sort of two questions. Why would they do it, and do they want to
Yes.
do it? And I mean, why would they do it? Let me talk about toasters for a second. So
Okay.
you see, especially we have a war going on at the moment, and well, there's a kind of sinister meaning to this here. But we have so we have a very classic land war going on at the moment between Russia and Ukraine, right?
Yes.
And especially initially in Russia's military campaign, Russia had very high losses, and the Russian forces were losing a lot of tanks. And the Ukrainians were very, very good, at least initially, at taking out, those tanks. Also, the Russians had loads of logistics problems and so on. And colloquially, I've been told in Russia, these tanks were called toasters because, they would be blown up by the Ukrainians or targeted by the Ukrainians. And it's horrific to imagine that the people inside would be burning to death. right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrific to imagine this, but that's the reality of war. And you can just say, from a military perspective, well, you want to minimize your losses, for example, right? I mean, that's certainly a motivation behind drone usage. You don't have to worry so much about a pilot. You know, if you have an aeroplane, you know, that aeroplane might crash, you might get shot down, your pilot might die, you might have to rescue a pilot, for example, and you just don't have to worry about that with regard, to a more automated or remote controlled system. The other reason as to why militaries might want this, I think, again, has to do with the good old question of speed of reaction times. How fast can you react to a particular attack? And automation has, of course, certain advantages here. I mean, again, so we're talking a lot about Israel, but of course, it's one of the major defense powers, right? And military kind of powers and very highly sophisticated military technology. But look at something like the Iron Dome as a highly sophisticated missile defense system. You have sort of this trajectory of incoming missiles. The Iron Dome can, calculate an interception point, or it can calculate the trajectory, the course of the incoming missile in the first place, whether it's, going to hit a populated area or not, whether there's, potential damage or potential casualties. It can then calculate an interception point, really. It can then give a recommendation at the moment to a human operator as to whether to launch a counterattack or not. So that has to be approved by a human individual. But you can just imagine, sort of someone sitting down and having to do certain calculations as to where this missile is going to land, where to interject it. By that time, it's all over. So I think,
speed.
Yeah, so speed, reaction times. The third one, I would say, has to do with detection, potentially by an enemy. You could say that's one of the downsides of remote control systems. What you have with remote control systems, in a way, is a communications link between the operator and the actual platform. And of course, that communications link can be detected. Countermeasures can be taken by your enemy, for example.
Which is happening a lot in Ukraine right now. I think
absolutely, happening a lot.
The major
in
problem.
Ukraine. Yeah, also in other theaters, in other contexts, and automating here, or even using more advanced versions of machine autonomy might make a lot of sense. So those would be some of the things as to why militaries sort of want this. Right. Do they want it? So why they would seek it? Do they necessarily want it? So I think there are some worries, having talked to, for example, the Royal Air Force in the UK, also having talked to the German Air Force. I mean, there are questions about the legality of those systems. Certainly, it seems to me military officials are aware, and they have to be aware if they follow international law, that the deployment of such systems would have to clear certain legal hurdles, for sure. And I guess that's something they are worried about. And they're, of course, especially worried about that with regard to the actual application of force to a target, when these criteria of distinction, proportionality, military necessity, and so on really do start to matter. And I guess sort of there is some skepticism within some militaries. On the other hand, there's also a lot of development of autonomous systems, of remote controlled systems. But I would sort of shy away from just describing militaries, also military officials, just as sort of mindless cheerleaders of a particular technology and just saying, there's something new, we want it. No, I mean, there's thinking going on, about the legal framework, what this means, for a particular branch of the military and so on, right. And so forth. And I think people are aware that there are certain legal hurdles that need to be cleared, for sure.
I'm sure militaries are also very averse towards giving away control to something they don't understand. And
absolutely, not necessarily. Yeah, because it could act illegally, potentially. Yeah. I mean, it could be unpredictable in its operating environment, which is obviously a risk factor here, and thus lead to violations of, international humanitarian law, the laws of conflict. But also, and I've raised this with a couple of sort of military officials, but also NGOs. How can you be sure that such a system might not turn against you?
Exactly.
That's of course, or might be hacked or spoofed by accident, or also by enemy interference, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there precedence for this? Has a hacking attack on military systems on some large scale happened?
Well, I think with drones, for example, I mean, sort of communications links. I mean, you mentioned
Yes,
Ukraine,
yeah.
but also, the hacking by Iranians of American drone systems and so
Mhm,
on. Yeah, I
mhm,
mean, that has
mhm.
definitely happened. That's definitely
Yeah.
going on. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, in the military context, this happens all the time, of course.
Mm.
Like the Israel or probably Israeli-American effort to hack into Iranian, I think it was enrichment plants.
Enrichment plants, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
But that's sort of more a
obviously
question of cyber capabilities, probably. But
Yes.
you can see how these overlap, right? If you
Mhm.
kind of start to attack an information infrastructure, communications infrastructure, if that infrastructure is hooked up to a particular weapons platform, of course,
Mhm.
you potentially have a problem. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm. Absolutely. Quite the topic. How do you? What's your feeling about this? Is it? Are you optimistic that we will use this technology to defend our nations better, to have more adherence to international law, or is your feeling in general that this is going the wrong way?
I'm a pessimist.
You're a
Genuinely. I think the
pessimist.
more I study armed conflict and the more I study politics. I've been doing that now all my adult life. I become ever more pessimistic. I think I'm sure those systems will be used. I think they will become increasingly sophisticated. I think there would be a further push towards automation, towards high levels of autonomy within systems. Yeah, and I think ultimately those sorts of systems will be deployed. So I'm a pessimist. So I'm just saying, look, we have a lot of regulation. We have international
they will be
humanitarian law.
deployed, and that will be a bad thing. Right.
But, I mean, it's really hard to sort of predict the impact of a particular weapons technology. But I think there is an interesting parallel here, and that parallel is with precision weaponry. So there are very few advocates of autonomous weapon systems, but some, advocates do make this, or would argue that autonomous weapon systems are sort of analogous or an extension of precision weaponry. And you can see how especially debates or normative discourses around precision play a huge role, within international law, but also with regard to how militaries, try to justify particular, military campaigns. Sort of, for example, really interesting. If you look at, for example, I'm sorry, I'm banging on about the Israel-Gaza thing.
Right.
Of course, it's happening at the moment. But if you think or if you look, for example, at kind of previous conflicts between Hamas and Israel, for example, in 2014, there is a lot of Israeli emphasis on precision. There's far less, it seems to me, emphasis on precision now. So you see how precision sort of shifts during the Kosovo War, 1999. NATO, without UN authorization, goes to war against Serbia in order to hold, ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Again, we have a 100-day bombing campaign, but that bombing campaign is said to be very, very precise indeed, and you can take all sorts of issues with that. In a way, the first Gulf War, 1990, 1991, where we have GPS, guided targeting, and we can show you in our video conference presentations how, our cruise missiles enter the air conditioning shaft of a particular building, and blow it up. I mean, compare this to the bombing of Dresden or German cities during World War One. Compare this to the bombing of Vietnam by the Americans during the Vietnam War. Probably back in that day, precision meant if you can sort of drop it within a square mile, that's precise. Obviously, very, very different from a cruise missile entering into a ventilation shaft in a building. So, but anyway, you see some people in this field making this comparison with precision weaponry, and you would say, well, precision weaponry is a good thing, and even the International Committee of the Red Cross would say so. It would urge belligerents to to follow international law, and to say that, as per international law, belligerents should really use the least harmful method in order to pursue their objective. And that's of course precision weaponry. You want to in a way contain the harm or the damage you do. You want to kind of, I suppose, square the circle between pursuing your military objective and minimizing harm, especially to civilian infrastructure and especially to civilians. And yet, there is an argument, I think, in the literature on armed conflict whether precision weaponry actually is not so much as a restraint on armed conflict, but might have actually a perverse opposite effect, namely that precision weaponry seems so attractive, especially to militaries, reinforces the idea that what you're doing as well, meets the law, meets all legal expectations, that you're actually much more prepared to use and to go to war and to engage, in the use of armed force than you may have been under other, with other weapon systems. So even here, I think the kind of impact of something that prima facie on the outset seems normatively attractive might potentially be very, very different from the reality. I think you can say something similar about autonomous weapons. Yes, I can see the kind of normative claim. So let's really assume that autonomous weapons reduce, for example, civilian casualties. That's very often an argument that's made in favor of this. Well, normatively it's attractive, but what does the history of armed conflict actually tell us? And if you make this comparison with precision weapons, then I don't know. I mean, that probably just shows why I'm a pessimist about this. I think things probably are getting better, you could argue, to some extent, but I just don't think they're going to be as great as some of those who are more optimistic about armed conflict would argue. So I can see the point, but I remain very, very skeptical if I look at just how military technology has developed.
Yeah. Let's talk about arguments against autonomous weapon systems. So you've mentioned they might just have an bad effect on warfare. What you mentioned was that they might give militaries the view that what they're doing is a very targeted strike and therefore legitimate. And then resulting in more such strikes and more deaths.
That's right.
Not the effect on warfare that some people hope from these systems.
That's right.
Another argument that you also talk about in your work is that these systems might create a responsibility gap. What's that? What are we talking about here?
So, I mean, the responsibility gap is something that came up in the discussion of machine autonomy more generally. And so that's not just, in the case of autonomous weapons, but it's a general sort of worry about machine autonomy. And I guess there are different ways of understanding this, but the way I understand it is to say, look, you have an autonomous system, and this autonomous system might behave in particular ways, so it might exhibit machine behavior that can't be entirely foreseen or predicted by the person launching the system. Hence, and I think here those people who argue in favor of this first point are moving a little bit too fast. Hence, no one is responsible. Of course, you can't hold the system responsible. That doesn't make sense. But you can't really hold the operator responsible either. Nor can you hold the manufacturer responsible for this. So in this case, some would argue you have this responsibility gap. Something goes wrong, and we have to talk about. Are we talking about responsibility in a legal sense? Are we talking about it in a moral sense? But in a moral sense, there would be no one to blame. For example, in those kinds of cases. So you sometimes see this coming up, for example, in the work of Rob Sparrow, who's an Australian philosopher and a bioethicist who's written on this topic. So he has something to say about this, and he's sort of opposed to autonomous weapons, at least initially, on those grounds. You also get this in other literature, that there is something in the way that these weapons undermine a commitment to responsibility within the armed forces. Yeah, so that's the responsibility gap, quite famously. Right. But I remain a critic of the responsibility gap. I should add. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's sort of two things in a way which strike me wrong about this. So, one obviously here is the kind of question of killing, right? Or the use of armed force against the target. And I guess one sort of way to challenge the responsibility gap is to be sort of quite bold and quite controversial and to say, well, does responsibility actually matter morally? Is it really as important as some people think it is? And in particular, in order to be allowed to kill, do you need to be responsible for the act of killing? I can think about instances where that's not the case, where I think an agent can still permissibly kill another person without necessarily fulfilling the precondition for responsibility or for moral responsibility. So I would think, for example, think about child soldiers who have very young child soldiers, who have very kind of, highly compromised individual agency. So really very young children. I would think there's nothing, so we would have qualms about holding those children responsible, for what they do. But I still don't think, for example, that they are prohibited from killing their captors to escape their situation, even if we can't fully hold them responsible for doing that. So that would be one problem I have. The other problem is that I think the responsibility gap really lets people off the hook for taking a risk, right? The whole point, in a way, about an autonomous system is that of course it has advantages and disadvantages, but it's undeniable that I guess the unpredictable nature, and again, unpredictability requires some unpacking, but that the unpredictable nature means that you're imposing a risk on other parties, right? If I dispatch a robot and tell it to do something on a battlefield, and I know it's going to do something, but not exactly what, I don't exactly know what the machine behavior is going to be within its operating environment. I'm imposing a considerable risk on people. And
so
to just
you are
say
responsible for taking that risk.
Yeah, for not necessarily for what the machine does, but for the imposition of a risk. And that, for me, settles the responsibility gap. I've sort of since thought about this a little bit more, and occasionally do some thinking about this. But I would sort of compared to my previous work, I would kind of more strongly separate now between what I would call a metaphysical responsibility gap and a practical responsibility gap, right? So the metaphysical responsibility gap really is a gap where there is no agent in the world who would meet the criteria for being held responsible for something that happened on the battlefield or in the area of deployment of any autonomous machine. So no agent has the kind of preconditions here for ascriptions of responsibility. The practical gap, I think, is actually more realistic, and I would worry about it much more about the metaphysical one. So I think you impose a risk, blah blah blah, that's all fine, you're responsible. But I think the practical problem is, especially with these autonomous systems and especially with systems that have a stealth function, that it might not actually be able to determine who deployed it. And you can see sort of a comparison in cyber. So in cyber warfare, for example, where it's not quite clear very often, who attacked you in the first place. Someone might have planted a computer virus somewhere. You might be, subject to a cyber attack, but you can't actually determine who that was. So that's called the problem of attributability. You can't attribute a particular act to a particular agent. And I can see that that's very much a practical problem. So there might very well be a military, even a particular officer who deployed the robot, but whose robot is it in the first place? We might be finding it very hard to identify that, right?
But within the military force, it should probably get easier to identify that, right?
So you could, depending, I'm just sort of thinking from an international perspective. How often, for example, are really cyber attacks, completely identified and completely attributed to another party? And you can very well see that for some militaries, or even probably some intelligence, organizations, that constitutes a huge advantage. That you don't have to sort of think too much about whether your enemy will able to attribute particular behavior to you. For example,
so
you don't have
flag operations become
false
easier.
flag operations. For example, so that would be a problem that I would see. Right. You see this very often. You see this already. When militaries, especially when it comes to special forces operations, tell you and say, "Well, we can't confirm or deny." It's just like, we are not telling you. Well, you won't be able to attribute anything to us anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
So the practical, so I should say I'm not so worried about the metaphysical responsibility gap, but I'm worried about the practical one. But I think it is important to distinguish between the two. That's what I would say.
Makes sense. So you say in your work that rather than focusing on responsibility, we should be focusing on risk.
Yeah, that's one of the upshots of that, yes. Yeah. So I think we shouldn't be faffing about. I mean, sometimes I should say this. Sometimes I think philosophy can make your life difficult, but also sometimes it can make it a little bit easier. And sometimes, probably people don't see the forest for the trees. And I'm just saying, well, look, don't think so much about responsibility. I mean, that's a big topic, in metaphysics and in, moral philosophy and legal philosophy anyway. Make your life easier. Think about risk. And that's also something I think that you can sort of talk about when you interact with members of the military. Look, think about how risky is this going to be in the end. So, yes, so I think the important element is not such responsibility, but rather we should be talking about risk. How risky is this really to program a robot or program a self-driving tank, whatever, and dispatch or deploy it in a particular theater? And I think that should be the sort of main discussion, among other things, but that should be one of the planks of the main discussion. And the stuff about responsibility is just faffing around. It just sort of distracts really from a really, really important issue. And look, I mean, when it comes to the risks, anything in life is risky. But it's sort of partly about also an empirical question. Is it really more risky than deploying other weapon systems? For example, a non-autonomous weapon system. Well, I mean, they can have significant risks, as we see with precision weaponry. Precision weapons have sort of short-term but also long-term considerable risks. So I would say risk assessment is more important than responsibility here.
Would you say so for individual militaries or also for something like international regulation?
Yeah, I think for both, really. I mean, I think that's the question for a military, especially do you think that the risks you start to impose on others are so severe that they undermine your commitment to international law? And also, of course, for international regulation. Although, I mean, to be honest, I mean, with these systems, and I know that, there have been NGOs in the area that have been arguing for a legal prohibition of those systems, falling short of that, of a moratorium, and so on and so forth. And I just don't think, there's sort of much ground for that. I have all sorts of misgivings about international law. Partly, I think international law just represents state interest. There we go. I mean, I sound like a realist about international relations here. But I think it's much more fruitful, so to take it down a notch, as it were, and to just say, well, let's talk about risk. Yes, sure, you might make a legal case as to why these weapons shouldn't necessarily be prohibited under international law, but it might still be really, really risky thing to do. So let's talk about that. Yeah, so risk is an important thing. And especially, I guess, whether in deploying such a system, I mean, you're not only imposing a risk, but are you somehow being negligent, or are you somehow being reckless in doing that? So there is I think widely questioning about recklessness and negligence in armed conflict. And I guess, with the sort of analogy with precision weapons, the idea is that sometimes new technologies can make you more reckless, and that actually they don't restrain, but they have the opposite effect on your actions. But that's, I think, sort of partly where the debate should go, towards risks.
I think, as far as I've read, in terms of militaries, and especially the US military, does go in that direction quite a lot, because they're quite worried about unpredictability and risks that they cannot foresee. So that's a good thing. I think they should be worried about this. Yes, they should be, absolutely. Yeah. Right. So focus on risk. That's a big takeaway. There is another argument that you make that you do not reject, that you call the argument from human agency.
That's right.
What's that? What's it about?
Yeah. So I mean, that's there's a lot to say about this, and I have kind of thought myself a lot about what the argument actually does, and there are different ways of presenting it. But I guess sort of my reasoning behind this was to say, let's eliminate all the issues arising from risk. And some of the things we philosophers do is to engage in thought experiments. So people sort of sometimes come up and criticize, yeah, this couldn't really happen in reality. And it's like, yeah, it's a thought experiment, right? And, just as John Rawls' original position is a thought experiment, or the brain in the vat is a thought experiment, or whatever. But the idea really here is to assume, what are we actually, what are some people objecting to when they think about this technology? Are they just really objecting to the risks that technology brings? And that would certainly be someone like me. I would be very sort of skeptical that the risks can be contained. I mean, I would think, given my earlier comments on precision weaponry, that sometimes it really would be reckless to use these kinds of systems. But is this really just a question of risk? Is it too risky or not? Or is there something sort of deeper lurking underneath? So the argument from human agency sort of rests on this thought experiment of the perfectly functioning autonomous weapon. So the deployment of such a weapon would not be risky at all. Have some risks of all, but there would not be negligence somehow, or there would not be reckless. So by and large, it would perform quite well, or we could even predict with high certainty what it does. So it isolates, I think, the thought experiment, the factor of risk here. And it said, look, are we really just worried about the risk, or is there something else? And I think what I try to get to in the argument, or with this argument from human agency, is there something else other than risk? It can't be responsibility, at least not how the people who talk about the responsibility gap set it up, but could there be potentially something else? So we could imagine sort of two parallel situations again. So where I, order a soldier to kill the soldier of an opposing army, and then other things being equal, exactly the same scenario where I program a robot to do so. And I guess the argument for human agency is that in the end, we need to distinguish between human agency and artificial agency. And the kind of distinctive feature here of human agency is that we have the ability to do otherwise. So still as the soldier being asked to carry out the order, you still have to make a decision to pull the trigger. The robot won't have to make this decision. And so if I go a little bit into the historical literature, empirical literature, especially on World War II, Men Under Fire, the famous historical account as to whether soldiers really aimed their rifles or aimed their machine guns at other soldiers, or sort of deliberately did not target them, deliberately missed them, and so on. So I think there is a question here about human agency and the ability not to kill, and I think that's important sort of to preserve, even in circumstances where the target of the attack would potentially be a legitimate target, and by that I would mean that the target has no right not to be killed and cannot hold the other party under a duty corresponding to a negative right not to attack it. So that's what human agency in a way is about. It says, look, it's not just about the consequences, but there seems to be something intrinsically valuable about sort of human choice here and the human ability to do otherwise. So I mean, I guess the question then is, what does the argument actually do? And I guess people who are more interested in consequences in ethics sort of could come back and say, well, just imagine, Alex, that really you are too pessimistic here. You should be much more optimistic. And that indeed, we will know that the deployment of these weapon systems will significantly reduce, in a way, casualties on the battlefield. And you are, sending soldiers in because you want to preserve human agency. And those soldiers, some of them don't shoot, others do shoot, others again engage in war crimes. And look, we're looking at utopian warfare here, and that's where the science fiction comes in, of really reducing, as it were, casualties. Would you still persist with human agency in a way? And I guess, there's sort of two answers of it. I mean, one is to say you could be really hard-nosed and sort of Kantian about it and say, yes, of course, even if the consequences are very bad, you must never, for example, violate the categorical imperative. And we all know those sorts of, discussions. But the other one would be to say, well, look, what the argument from human agency does, it shifts the burden of proof, not from the person who says, I'm very skeptical about this weapon system, so it's very pessimistic, but to the optimist and says, look, if you want to go and substitute sort of human agency for artificial with artificial agency, well, your burden of proof is going to be very, very high that really the consequences of the deployment of such systems, or the shift from human agency to artificial agency, is very, very beneficial indeed. You have to prove your case. I don't have to prove mine so much. So I think that's how the argument sort of really, really functions. I could probably argue, you get this sometimes in moral philosophy, this idea of threshold deontology. Yes, you are a deontologist to, up to a certain point, but there could even be scenarios where you potentially have to say, well, consequences would be so incredibly beneficial, and you kind of have to reduce, or you have to weaken deontological restrictions at least a little bit. So you get this, for example, in the work of the philosopher Francis Cam, who talks about, a threshold deontology. So you could read the argument for human agency to say, yes, there are deontological restrictions on what we may do to others, of course, but there could be particular thresholds, but those thresholds would be very high, and the burden of proof is on those who wants to, in a way, I wouldn't say violate these thresholds, but we want to sort of overstep these thresholds, or who thinks that the consequences will really just sort of lie above those thresholds.
Because there is value in human agency, even if it is, or especially if it is something like the decision to kill.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the decision to kill under orders. I don't think, I think that would be really, really, really dangerous to start treating soldiers as robots. No. The enactment even of an order is a very, very complex process, even for an individual soldier. So I'm very much sort of against the view, soldiers are sort of just robots. No. They're two very, very different things.
Yeah. That seems, we should be very careful about this for sure. And I think being lax about this can have very devastating consequences.
Absolutely, very detrimental. It should probably also say, just sort of on this point of the argument from human agency. So especially relatively early on in the debate, and especially when sort of a lot of NGOs enter this, and they also have their particular objectives and so on. But there was sort of a lot of very unspecified talk about machines shouldn't kill people, or, robots shouldn't be, programmed to kill. But of course, as it very often goes with these sorts of slogans, where's the kind of normative basis on which you make them? Are you actually having a normative basis, or are you just, in a way, working according to a yuck factor? Oh, I don't like something. I think this is yucking. What exactly would potentially be so bad about programming a machine to kill? And I think the argument of human agency says, no, hang on. I want to know a little bit more about what you're actually objecting to.
That's a good segue to the next topic. Let's talk about the ban.
There
are activists like the Campaign for Killer Robots, but also the UN Secretary General has said human control must be retained in life and death decisions, and the autonomous targeting of humans by machines is a moral line that we must not cross. That's actually from a joint statement of the UN Secretary General and the International Committee of the Red Cross. So quite a big call for an international ban. There's been the Convention for certain conventional weapons at the UN, and also talk at the UN Security Council about some form of international ban on autonomous weapons. Other people say we have international humanitarian law, and the things you are worried about already are already banned by international humanitarian law. What's your position on this?
So I should say I'm not an international lawyer, but I guess my earlier comments also showed that I'm slightly skeptical about international law. Right? It does reflect state interest more often than not. So I guess I would also fall into the more cautious camp and say, look, before we throw out the baby with the bathwater, we have international humanitarian law, and let's see how this law applies to these kinds of systems. Sometimes you get this, we need to think again about the legal regulation of armed conflict, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that is necessarily the case at all. I mean, we have stuff and we can see if that applies. Now, I mean, the problem again is with all of this that it's not quite clear on what basis, even the UN Secretary General objects to all of this, and especially whether there is something intrinsically wrong with an autonomous weapon system. So that's one question. Of course, within the law, you have this question: are some weapons intrinsically wrong or intrinsically in contravention of legal criteria, or is it just their use, for example?
Yeah.
Sure, a machine gun can be used in all sorts of ways. I can shoot at a combatant with it, a legal target. I can shoot at a civilian with it. That doesn't make the machine gun intrinsically legal or illegal. It's my use of the weapon, right? You have other weapons, landmines, that can't be targeted. Anyone who steps on it, civilian or soldier alike, we got blown to pieces. Here you can say, well, intrinsically, it can't fulfill the kind of requirements of international law, especially the criterion of distinction. So, I mean, I can't really see that there could be such a blanket ban. You could imagine, personally, I would say, situations in which probably this could be targeted, and autonomous weapon systems could be targeted quite reliably, at a particular target. There's a question of risk here. Of course, we can talk about that. That's no problem at all. But I just don't think there are necessarily the resources within the law to say, look, we need an entire ban on this. Legally speaking, for example, I don't think there's anything wrong at all, apart from this issue of risk, by programming a robot to destroy another robot. By, programming, I don't want to sound too science fictiony, but to program an autonomous spaceship to take out your enemy's communication satellites. I can't see from the perspective. I mean, it might be a good tactic or a bad tactic. That's another question. But from a legal perspective, I can't see anything wrong with it. If there's a high reliability in target identification and the risks are relatively moderate, the sort of risks we would impose on others during armed conflict, I can't see anything illegal or necessarily illegal about this. So I'm skeptical that there could be such sort of a very comprehensive ban. Now, when it comes, to the sort of use against human targets, obviously, I mean, then you really have this pretty thorny problem, practical problem of having to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, or soldiers and civilians, however you want to frame it. And yes, in a thought experiment, I can imagine that this, problem can be overcome. Potentially, sure, I can imagine a lot of things in thought experiments, but that's really going to be, kind of a big challenge for machines, because what's involved in a way is a kind of qualitative judgment whether a particular individual encounter. Sure, I mean, machines are good at picking out humans, right? If you look at something like the Samsung Sentry robot that's used in the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea, it's highly accurate in distinguishing a human individual, for example, from a military vehicle, or an animal from a human individual, or a rock from a human individual, or whatever. That's not the problem. It's the qualitative judgment. That's really the problem. Is it a combatant, or is it a civilian, or is it a non-combatant, right? So that's the issue here. But, and here I can see that international law potentially in and of itself is completely sufficient to deal with the problem already with the resources that it has. Simply to say, look, you can't fulfill the criterion of distinction. Tough luck. But, there might be other circumstances where that's the case, where you can fulfill legal criteria. So I don't think a blanket ban is, necessarily going to work. Probably you can write in bans to prohibit the targeting of humans via such, sort of machines in armed conflict, sure. But I can't really see a blanket ban on, autonomous weapon systems as such.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back a little bit and talk about some of the reasons why, specifically also the campaign to stop killer robots, talk about why they want to ban those things.
Yep,
and a lot of these relates to risk, and also risk in a larger sense, not just of that particular mission, but risk of what that might do to the entire landscape. So one thing people are very worried about is that terrorist groups and non-state actors get very easy access to what effectively amounts to weapons of mass destruction.
Yep.
The weapons of mass destruction claim here is I have to think about this a little bit, but basically the argument says that it becomes very cheap to kill. So if you say, even if you put a relatively high per unit price on a small drone, small quadcopter that autonomously can kill someone with a charge attached, it would, in mass production, definitely not cost more than $50 to produce one of these. And if you have resources and invest in stockpiling these weapons, then you become very close to the effectiveness and economic effectiveness of atomic weapons. So one nuclear weapon, I mean, those are very rough numbers, but costs about $1 billion to produce. And with $1 billion, if you have 50 dollars per piece, and you say one piece, you generally two of these will kill one person if you deploy them in a city. You're at something like you can kill 10 million people with this. So that's one comparison, specifically the campaign to ban killer robots, and Stuart Russell, who is a big proponent of that campaign, often makes.
Yeah, I think that was part of his Reith lecture on the BBC. I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, he gave the Reith lectures for the BBC, didn't he? And I think the last Reith lecture was on this sort of analogy between nuclear weapons and between autonomous weapons potentially.
What do you think about this, and how does it reflect on the whole debate?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I'm married to a nuclear weapons specialist, so my wife does study nuclear weapons. So the topic is quite close to mine. I remain very interested in nuclear weapons too. So I've just been teaching a course at Surrey, and nuclear deterrence played a big part in that. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I mean, the question again is, so there's a question about terrorism, right? And I guess when it comes to weapons of mass destruction within the security services, there are kind of two views on this, right? One view is, well, it would be absolutely horrific if terrorist groups got hold of weapons of mass destruction. The other view is, well, actually, we shouldn't worry really too much about weapons of mass destruction at all. They're far too difficult to obtain, for those sorts of groups. If you can drive a vehicle into a crowd, you hijack a vehicle somewhere and you drive it into a crowd, as for example, sympathizers of ISIS did, in the 2010s, in various European towns. That already gets us. So, in a way, low-level costs already get you the sort of impact you deserve. So don't worry too much about weapons of mass destruction. I guess, look, it seems to me any weapon systems can be abused, right? So if you really start to stockpile these kinds of autonomous, robots as a terrorist group, I think by definition, you're going to not care very much at all about any legal bans on it. I mean, the whole point of terrorism is that it breaks legal or moral norms around armed conflict. So terrorists, engage in terrorism. That's why they're classified in a way as terrorists. So I don't think terrorist groups would be deterred at all by a ban on this. It might make it more difficult for them to get hold of some of the technology, for sure. But if there's a will, there is a way. And especially because it seems to me some of the technology involved is not quite going to be at the same level as, for example, in the case of nuclear weapons or getting certain chemical compounds or so, which are much more strictly regulated. Unless, of course,
very difficult to regulate this technology.
Absolutely, so it's much harder to regulate.
Simple sensors.
Absolutely, unless you really say we ban it for everyone, and that would be such a harsh ban. I don't see, that people would put up with that necessarily. So I don't think terrorists will be deterred either way, right? For them, it's just a practical question: can we get hold of stuff or not? And that might become more difficult, or that might become easier. I mean, even if you stockpile a lot of, sort of weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems, the question is, would you still follow the law? That pertains to autonomous weapons. Then, if the law is unclear on this, so I mean, if you have loads of autonomous weapons and you say, I'm strictly going to deploy them in accordance with international humanitarian law, they meet distinction, they meet military necessity, they meet proportionality, I don't sort of as such see a big problem. Right? That's the question, can you really do that or can't you do that? Is it really reasonable for you to assume that you will comply with the law? Indeed. But as such, the fact that you have loads of these systems, that doesn't seem to matter very much. If it becomes harder for international law to regulate those sorts of weapons, and I think you see this, and here I think the analogy with nuclear weapons is stronger, then I think there are loads of things that states in particular can still do in order to avoid conflict or in order to avoid negative effects of having these kinds of weapons. So, for example, in the case of nuclear weapons, adopting a no first use policy. Yep. Saying, look, in terms of deterrence, we would only ever really use nuclear weapons if we were attacked. But we have a strict no first use policy. That's I think the policy of China, for example, as a nuclear weapon state, putting all sorts of regimes in place, putting all sorts of international forums in place where you can engage in nuclear diplomacy, for example, but by analogy could also engage in diplomacy on these kinds of matters, building trust, agreeing certain sort of frameworks that might fall short slightly of an outright ban, but that can still have a useful impact on international order as such. So here I think the nuclear weapons analogy might make sense, right? So we don't always need to look for outright bans on a weapon in order to preserve sort of international order, or in order to deal with some of the potential side effects. There might be other mechanisms for us, or sort of available to us as well. Reassuring others, engaging in dialogue, establishing trust between parties, and so on and so forth. And that sort of falls slightly short of a ban.
Mm-hmm. In more practical terms, what do you think could happen? Like, what effect could autonomous weapon systems have on global power dynamics?
Well, I think, again, it depends on what you think about when you think about an autonomous weapon system, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, are you really thinking about the kind of quadcopter drone that's quite easy to manufacture? You can see this as having a huge impact in the current Russia-Ukraine war, for example. If you think about more sophisticated systems, really the sort of, the autonomous submarine, the completely autonomous bomber drone, that just tracks its radars, that just tracks, the targets it wants to, or it's been programmed to attack without operator interference, then I think we're sort of talking states, and we're talking kind of big powers that have the R&D capacity to really, develop these kinds of systems. So I think, overall, the impact is going to be quite mixed. There will be smaller powers who can get something, again, depends on how demanding your threshold for autonomy is, right? That will be able to sort of gain some systems that give them some advantages on the battlefield. But when it comes to these really big systems, I would think that the big players in defense and the military technology will be the main beneficiaries of that. But then, of course, can be a driver again of global inequality. Right, of global asymmetry between different states. Yeah, I mean, it's very. So
that will go more in the direction of it benefits bigger players rather than.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, you see, again, I think here the analogy again with nuclear weapons is, sort of a very interesting one, where you have certain nuclear weapon states are recognized under international law as nuclear weapon states, and, they're effectively saying we can have the stuff. We agreed sort of to, sort of reduce our arsenals a little bit, but you can't have it. And there is this kind of asymmetry or kind of imbalance between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And I would think when it comes to these sophisticated systems that there's something similar play here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you thought a lot about defense against autonomous weapons? Like if you go with the nuclear analogy, there is just from the technological point of view, there is the nuclear technology, nuclear bomb technology, but then there is also this massive area of missile defense that became much more important through nuclear weapons.
That's right.
What kind of analogies do you see? How do you defend against an autonomous attack?
I think that's kind of a technical question, isn't it? Yeah. So I don't think I'm too much of a technological expert on that, but I do consider that in the book because it is an important question when you start to assess the pros and cons of autonomous weapon systems. Because a lot of the arguments in favor of autonomous weapon systems, of course, seem to assume implicitly, and it's very often, I think, important to draw the implicit assumptions in particular arguments. But implicitly, I think the assumption very, very often is that you have some sort of military supremacy. Right, that you remain in a way the dominant party. Yes, you can adopt. Yes, you can adopt more restrictive targeting standards, for example, by deploying the autonomous weapon, leading to fewer casualties on the battlefield because you are in charge and your enemy hasn't caught up yet. But I think people will, or militaries and others will, sort of develop countermeasures. They will say, how can we deny our enemy that particular advantage or that particular technology? And that will then impact, of course, on the kind of moral case that you can make for or against, a specific weapon. Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think that'll be a big question and kind of big development of. Say, I mean, it's of course one application, but say we think about drones and like small anti-personnel drones.
Mm-hmm.
There will at some point be the first attack on civilians with these.
Of course, absolutely.
Whether that will be in the next 10 years or in the next whatever, but
I think my pessimism has rubbed off on you now.
There we go. Possibly.
Possibly.
And then there will be this big question of how do we defend our cities? Like, do we have nets or everywhere that can deploy, or do we have like
electronic countermeasures,
EMG devices, electronic countermeasures, stuff
absolutely.
like that.
I guess we started off this. We started off about this at the beginning. I mean, Israel and Hamas in Gaza. I mean, what's the countermeasure? You start digging tunnels. Hamas is primitive from a military perspective. It's just sort of, I don't want to say ragtag insurgent group, but it has very, very light weaponry, and it's confronting one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. What's the response to that? And especially, of course, a military that has air supremacy. It will largely, prior to the current war, attack from the air, with drones or with jets or with helicopters. Well, what do? You start digging. It's slightly insane if you think about it, but that's of course the electronic the general countermeasure. So I heard of. Yeah, very, very effective. I mean, it's not clear at all at the date we are speaking how much of the tunnel network under Gaza Israel really has destroyed. And of course, I mean, they wouldn't tell us, right? But you can see really where the problem lies. I mean, I think there was also the case with remote control systems that, people, especially in Afghanistan and some of the tribal areas in Pakistan, would just start to use tinfoil in order to, or glass in order to try to blind the sensor suite of particular systems. Yeah, so that the pilot couldn't sort of properly see. But where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've seen lasers being used against, but that's
lasers. Lasers. I mean, all sorts of other things. Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. What a topic.
Absolutely, yes, it is. Certainly is.
What kind of advice would you give people who work in the field?
To work in the field,
or who consider working in the field, developing, building legal frameworks, building regulations.
Yeah, I think there are two things I would say. I mean, the first thing is try to be as conceptually accurate as you can about what constitutes machine autonomy, what constitutes a weapon system, what are you exactly worried about. And I think here philosophy can make a contribution, because as philosophers we try to be precise and we try to reflect on the terms that we use. Are you talking about autonomy, for example, with regard to wider combat supporting functions? For example, the ability of a tank, talked about this earlier, to autonomously navigate its territory, or are you really talking about this with regard to very restrictive functions, namely that pertain to targeting? Those are the sort of issues that I would highlight here. Be precise in how you describe these systems. I mean, the second thing I would say is don't get, and this is of course very difficult, but don't get sort of sidetracked by arguments that might be quite interesting, that might sound very sophisticated, but that have very few ramifications. So I think the issue of risk, so that was the option sort of earlier on, of the debate earlier on, that's much more important than some of the other stuff. So try to keep some of the essentials in mind, and don't get too sidetracked or start to chase down rabbit holes that you don't need at the moment. There's a need for academic, also philosophical abstraction, but I think there's also a need to kind of be realistic, partly about what's going to happen. I mean, just to give another example in that regard, I once had a sort of discussion with a younger scholar, and he said, well, the stuff about human agency, well, fair enough, you're saying this. The military could simply program some reflective capacity into the robot, shoot, don't shoot. And I could, yeah, sure, I can imagine that, but what's the incentive for the military to do that? They usually want you to destroy the target you've been ordered to destroy. Sure, I can entertain the thought, but is this really particularly realistic? So that's why I say be clear about what you're actually objecting to, and try to be sort of realistic in focusing on issues that really do matter and that are important, that advance your argument sort of somewhat in the policy space as well. And I think risk is an important factor here.
Yeah. Focus on risk and study philosophy.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. One more thing I want to talk about, and
of
this
course.
one is much more speculative than
Sure.
the rest of the things. So you distinguish between what you call a generation model and an execution model of autonomous targeting, where most of what we've been talking about would be the execution model, where
that's right.
Where the operative makes a decision on what the potential targets are, lays boundaries for what the mission is, and then the autonomous weapon system goes out and fulfills that mission, executes on that mission. Mostly the reason for why we've been talking about that is because it's much more relevant, because it's much more readily developed. Militaries are much more likely to accept it. And it's easier to build a lot. Because the generative model you're talking about makes even that decision. It makes the decision on which mission to take on which targets to choose, what is a legitimate target, and crucially, for international law, it makes the decisions on proportionality and military necessity. And that seems out of reach. It seems out of reach, and from everything I've heard military policymakers and generals say, undesirable. But I did a thing. I took I took your text, the text in your paper, where you talk about the war between two states, the state green and state yellow. And green is attacking yellow, and in an unjust war, and yellow has to defend itself and has to make the decision on whether to attack a factory that is necessary for it to win the war, even if 100 civilians will die in this attack. And I will quickly share my screen here. I asked the language model
excellent, I love it.
to make a decision on that point. I copied the text and I asked it to make a yes or no answer. It gives some reasoning. The reasoning seems like what you expect from. It's pretty reasonable, and it makes a decision. And the decision is yes, yellow should strike. And then you give a second scenario in which the military necessity has gone down. So the importance of the target has declined, but they could still attack, and it would still be important. but not as important as before.
Yeah.
And in this case, the model says, no, we should not strike. Now, there's a lot of things about this. Of course, the language in here is very suggestive as to what should actually happen. But the question I really want to ask is, do you think this kind of autonomy is still completely out of reach in the foreseeable future, or do you think from some standpoint it is not and could actually reasonably be developed?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't know to what extent this would fall sort of between actually the generating model and the execution model. So because here in this case, obviously the factory is a given, right? I guess with the generating model that I developed sort of in my work, the thing is really, would the AI be able to determine that the factory in itself is the kind of correct target? So I think this sort of falls somewhere in between sort of this sort of response to the prompt here between the two models.
So I'm not quite there yet.
I think it's not quite there yet, but as you know, I'm a pessimist, so we might be at some stage. So I think one of the sort of big question here is not so much the military necessity and proportionality, but it's really the question here of distinction. How can you distinguish this factory from, sort of other sort of military installations or other civilian installations? So how can you really make this qualitative judgment about the nature of the target? Whether this is a legitimate target or an illegitimate target. I guess here in the example, it's presupposed that the weapons factory or the factory, whatever it is already a legitimate target, and thus at least meets this kind of distinction criterion to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate targets. So I think that makes it slightly easier. But I think for the generating model, you're kind of more generating your own missions and your own targets. And I think that's sort of the point of it. And again, I would come back to something that I mentioned earlier. So this point about being precise in your language, because when I first, especially encountered some of these killer robots, people were very keen on a ban. Obviously, it wasn't really quite clear to me what they were talking about and what they were understanding by machine autonomy. But that really matters, obviously, in the debate. You should be as precise as possible when you're trying to ban something. All right. So there's this, famous sort of refusal by a judge to define what pornography is, whether pornography should be banned or not. And the reply of the judge in the US was, apparently just, I know it when I see it. Well, that's the worst definition you could possibly ever have, at least if you want to ban something under the law. But it seemed to me that a lot of the language was very imprecise, that sometimes, those involved in these debates were really suggesting that, in a way, these machines generate their own missions, generate their own targets. So very close to the kind of generating model, which the military doesn't want anyway. And I think the military is sort of quite sincere about that, at least for now, because there is this question of compliance with international law. But of course, I mean, that still leaves a lot of scope for the execution model. So I don't think the execution model should just be dismissed as such. And again, there's a question about being realistic. I can have an incredibly abstract idea of an autonomous weapon system and argue for a ban of such a system. And yes, probably a lot of military heads in the room will nod and go along with it. But probably their standard of autonomy is far lower, which is far closer to the execution model. So that's what I would say about that.
Right.
I would more broadly, sort of about the generating model. I mean, that model really would be quite revolutionary, because it seems to me, really, it would radically question the idea of the military, of the operating procedures of the military. It would essentially be analogous to, me giving you a gun and just say, "Good, toddle off," and go to war without giving you any orders, really, as to what your mission is. I mean, soldiers act under orders. They don't generate their missions themselves. They don't necessarily generate their targets themselves. There's a particular mission brief, particular orders, and the sort of generating model just seems to me analogous to just giving someone a gun and say, "Yeah, off you go." And I mean, that would be a challenge, really, to this whole idea of a chain of command and, to acting under orders, under authority, and so on. So I can see that for that very reason, militaries would be very kind of skeptical about such a model. So I think, again, the action again, philosophically, I can imagine something like a generating model, but I think the action really is much closer to the execution model, realistically, and that's really what we should be talking about. So, execution model, the risk that would follow from the execution model again, and that should give us enough to talk about, really, or to make
Alright.
a sort of have a fruitful discussion on this.
That makes sense. Well, in that case, to conclude, we established: be precise,
Yeah,
focus on risk, and study philosophy.
absolutely. That sounds very good indeed. And viewers or listeners can themselves decide whether they want to be optimists and pessimists. I leave that open for them.
All right. Thank you very much, Alex. This was great.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's great to talk to you. Cheers. Thank you, Dominic.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.